welcome to the Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode number 21. And this is continuing our coverage of James Kent's summary of his career in pop psychedelia and his attitude towards pop psychedelia, looking back on it at this point in his life. So today we are going to focus on episode number 7 of his final 10 podcast series. And I think that this episode, number 7, could be called the benefits issue, or like the problem of trying to view psychedelic drugs in terms of what benefits they can give you. And I think what emerges from this, there's going to be 3 separate narratives. One of them is the pop psych narrative on the benefits of psychedelic drug use, and then there's James Kent's counter narrative, very much against the prevailing pop psych understanding of psychedelic benefits, and then there's yours and mine interpretation of what benefits can mean in the context of psychedelia based on the Egodeath theory. So I'm hoping that will come out as this recording progresses. So James Kent is adamant, he's expressed this view in previous episodes, and he repeats it here, that psychedelic drugs are not compatible with modern Western culture because of his anthropological theory that as cultures modernize, they inevitably have to discard what he calls visionary ritual, which is really a euphemism for using psychedelic drugs in a cultural and religious context, something more than recreational party use or mild, fairly shallow psychotherapeutic use. So he's got this overall downer, pessimistic view about psychedelic drugs, in contrast to the overly positive, overly inflated pop psychedelia view of psychedelic drugs. He's very much of the view that psychedelic drugs are not going to save the world, that they don't really do very much in a kind of long-term basis, and that any kind of benefit or effect that they do have is purely short-term and purely limited. But then after the experience is over, it has to be recognized in the cold light of sobriety that the experience is unreal. It's just a drug experience. So that's very much a metaphysical or ontological point of view on the content of the psychedelic experience. So Kent explicitly acknowledges here that people can indeed have what he calls profound and powerful and potentially life-changing or personality-changing experiences on psychedelic drugs. But he then observes the problem that after having had a powerful, life-changing, very personal experience, you come back to the real world, the sober world, and the culture tells you, in the context of 20th century prohibitionism, that your experience was unreal and therefore illegitimate and incompatible with the cultural context that you live in. And this creates a problem because people feel as if their experience has some kind of value, some kind of real objective value, and the culture, the very modern Western materialist scientific-based culture, is telling them that their experience has no real lasting value and no relevance to the culture or to life more broadly. And I did sense a kind of chicken or egg inconsistency in James Kent's thinking on this issue, because mostly he seems to be saying that psychedelic drugs are incompatible with modernizing Western culture, and therefore they are made illegal, and that's the explanation of prohibition. But there are some points in this recording, episode 7 especially, where he seems to be saying it the other way round, and that actually prohibition comes first, and then it is declared, or it becomes the case, that the psychedelic experience is no longer compatible with modern Western culture. So the question is are psychedelic drugs illegal because they are incompatible with Western culture, or are they incompatible with Western culture because they are now illegal? And I'm not sure that his view on that is absolutely fixed. I think there's a clear inconsistency about that.
Right. Sometimes he seems to present it one way, and sometimes the other way. I mean, at times I came away with a strong impression that he treats prohibition of drugs as a kind of natural reaction to their introduction into society. He again thinks that their introduction into society has happened in the 60s. I have a note here that the people who made it illegal were genuinely motivated by concerns for safety. I have that down here. That, I mean, there's some. I seem to recall him saying something like, "Oh, all the lawmakers have looked at the case and decided that in fact they should be illegal." As if again that this is that's people are. All those decisions happened on some sort of like, I don't know, some sort of abstract realm where you're only taking into, it purely happened in a legal sphere having to do with their safety, and there were no other considerations that went into the creation of those laws, those prohibitionist laws.
So it sounds like he's taking the prohibitionist rhetoric at face value and believing it on the surface level. He has no critical dimension to his view of prohibition. So the prohibitionists claim, and all the anti-drugs propaganda claims, that drugs are this super dangerous thing and that prohibition is a response to the danger. But the critical Michael Hoffman style view is that the whole thing is a lie, driven by greed, racism, profiteering, that kind of thing. Michael Hoffman calls it the prohibition gravy train, or prohibition for profit, that it's fundamentally about making money and about persecuting people you don't like, and has nothing whatsoever to do with safety, and that whole level of it is purely purely a lie. There's one quotation from Michael Hoffman that really stood out, once read a long time ago on Egodeath.com, where he says that the support for prohibition is 100 miles wide, but it's only an inch thick, because of the fact that it just revolves in a very large number of very gullible people believing in a lie on a certain level, and then a very small minority of very powerful people at the top who don't believe in their own lie. They're the ultimate source of the lie, but they don't really buy into it, and they know perfectly well that what they're doing is disingenuous and they're trying to make money. They're some kind of the evil head prohibitionist, as opposed to the lower down gullible prohibitionists who have been sold a lie. And it seems like Kent is outing himself as being a part of that very broad but very thin understanding of prohibition, where he just simply thinks that it really is so super dangerous that the only possible thing that you can do with it is making it illegal.
Yeah, it's kind of baffling to me. I think we both had similar reactions listening to him, that to then start thinking about the larger context of prohibition and really, what it is. I mean, it got me thinking, when I think about prohibition, it's not merely just about making psychedelics legal. It's a much larger strategy. It's not super large, but it's much larger. There's an economic aspect to it. There's a legal and carceral aspect to it that is often wrapped up in the economic part. There's a global military aspect to it, often connected to that economic thing. And it was surprising to hear. Yeah, it just has surprised me since the beginning of this project to hear James Kent making arguments that align so closely with what essentially the prohibitionist line is on psychedelics, that they are dangerous and need to be controlled.
Right. There's also a strong element of the attitude that you identified in Amanda Fielding's speaking, where it's about blaming the 60s users for prohibition. So saying that because of all that debauchery and the hedonism and the recklessness and irresponsibility of the 60s generation when they had legal psychedelics, they had to be rescued from themselves. And so the prohibition that down the line the next generation suffers from is the fault of those original the dirty hippies. The attitude of blaming the 60s users for prohibition is prominent in James Kent.
Yes, if it weren't for those crazy people, all those whack jobs in the 60s, there's a larger. I was reflecting just before we started recording that there's a larger kind of re-listening to the end of this episode where he, not to jump ahead, but he starts talking about trepanation and kind of pseudoscience and stuff like that. That there's a larger thread here in this podcast series that it kind of like taking out a certain sort of aggression against a previous generation of essentially 60s people and their cultural experimentation and experimentation with a wide variety of ideas, that I think is probably an important context for. Kent seems resentful to have come up then in their wake in the 90s and had to filter or learn about stuff that they were interested in. I mean, I'm thinking back to his long list of pseudoscience, new age paradigms, metaphor systems, as we call them, that he resents now having had to learn about. And he takes like special glee in this episode, kind of roasting. Well, you mentioned Fielding and some of her people advocating this trepanation, voluntary trepanation of the skull. Kent seems to enjoy that, this kind of roasting your elders sort of thing. Not elders, I don't particularly like that term, but roasting the people who came before you for all their stupid ideas. Now we know better. Which, from my point of view, I mean, it's not necessary to defend or demonize really either. I don't think either is needed when dealing with those ideas. I think that, both end up leading to distortions on evaluating them and what their effect was and what their value going forward is in anyone's life. It's like, like I don't see I have no particular interest in trepanation, and I don't think anyone really needs to. But, I think it's a great, the question is like, what is our approach to these people having made these claims and their relationship to psychedelics? I think that's like a larger question that Kent is trying to like work his way through in these episodes. Like, what is the legacy of the 60s and the ideas of people in the 60s?
And I think that Michael Hoffman's attitude to that is generally, when you look at the previous generation of psychedelic scholarship, you just take the bits that you need. You take the bits that are good in order to go forward and build the new theory, build the Egodeath theory, and you can just dismiss, you can basically ignore the rest. And I think that James Kent lacks that kind of filter where he can take the really good, genuine, constructive, useful part of previous generations' thinking about psychedelia and then leave the rest. So he casts the net far too wide in terms of what he's going to address, and he ends up addressing a lot of things that are really not relevant at all to moving forwards in an understanding of psychedelia, such as trepanation. And that's really the reason why I just glossed over the whole section in the last recording where he talked about ketamine, because I just think that's not really worthy of discussion. It's just another opportunity for him to do some smearing and character assassination. And it's the reason why what we end up with here is so many hours of podcasting on his part to wade through to kind of pick out the good parts, the useful parts.
Right. I agree. Like, just to follow up on the trepanation bit, I mean, and why is he talking about that so long? Well, it just so happens that the people advocating that also happen to be heavy psychedelics users, but he doesn't really make a strong case for what this has to do, why we should care about it now when we are talking about psychedelics. what is the relevance? I mean, it's only like if you're invested in some, I don't know, defending the history of some imagined psychedelic community, that anyone who ever took psychedelics and any idea they ever had is something that everyone has to answer for. I don't share that idea at all. I don't care what previous. I don't necessarily care what any previous individual user of psychedelics did or thought. I'm interested in that, but it's not particularly relevant to. I don't know what psychedelics is in their place in human culture.
So Kent is so the thing about trepanation. It's really like Kent will use any possible thing he can find as a way of attacking the pop psychedelia figureheads, and it really comes down to his overall view towards pop psychedelia. I think this episode is particularly useful because it really makes it clear the James Kent's attitude towards pop psychedelia specifically, modern pop psychedelia, which is exactly the thing that you and I have been addressing in our earlier episodes of the podcast. So he starts talking about a psychedelic agenda, almost like a kind of conspiracy theory, where psychedelic proponents trying to find some kind of legitimization for their own personal transformative experiences try to infer theories about psychedelics that imply that they go beyond mere recreational use or recreational benefit or effect. So James Kent's own agenda, his own specific point of view, is that at the end of the day, psychedelics are not worth being taken any more seriously than a bit of fun and potentially a little bit of psychotherapeutic exploration. But he contrasts that with pop psychedelia, where they are saying that psychedelic drugs have relevance for diverse fields like political activism and environmentalism and miracle healing and that kind of thing, culminating at the extreme end in a kind of saviour syndrome, like saving the world, or galactic, broad galactic conspiracies. And it struck me there actually that I think that James Kent is falling victim to a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy by doing this, because in attacking what he sees as psychedelic savior syndrome, he's actually setting himself up as a savior, because he sees himself as the savior of pop psychedelia. He has explicitly said that he wants to save the next generation of pop psychedelicists from the mistakes that he made. So I feel that there's a self-reference in his podcast, which he is not aware of. And I just spotted that he really does see himself as his own very unique kind of savior syndrome. And its uniqueness is its negativity and its pessimism and its dismissiveness of the previous generation of thinkers.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. That he's really embodying that same sort of like, I've got the savior message here. The savior message is, he gets into this later in the episode. The savior message is the objective scientific method. That's it. Everything else, discard everything else. Keep that.
So he's kind of saying all of the wannabe savior claimants who came before me in the psychedelic field, such as Albert Hoffman and Jack Herer and these various people, they were all false prophets. I am the true prophet, and that's what the main point of these 10 episodes. His prophetic message, his 10 commandments are these 10 episodes of the podcast.
10 commandments, nice. I think he would be very annoyed at us for saying that, but I think that there's something to there is a deep similarity there's a similarity of like fundamentalism that a lot of like atheists and skeptics, self-identified atheists and skeptics fall into, that they're so busy attacking what they view as Christian fundamentalism. James kind of said it again and again. He's an atheist. He's part of the skeptic movement, so called, and I think that there's something that unfortunately there's a similarity of mindset or of approach, that there are certain fundamental truths that you have to adhere to in order to actually have the truth or participate in that community. And James Kent gets into that in this episode. He's got this very simplistic just so story about Western civilization progressing into an objective scientific method that now we use to sort out BS from the truth. And there's a lot of different ways to talk about this. I mean, I think that like what I tried to say earlier, it's a just so story. It's extraordinarily simple on the development of culture and how culture is developed, and it really doesn't work as history itself. But this is what the immediate point I'm trying to get at here is it fulfills a very similar role for atheists and skeptics as a kind of like religious fundamentalism does for the groups that they're attacking. And I think that this fits in with what you brought up about Kent and the savior syndrome. He thinks that people take psychedelics and then have a lot of bad ideas that they're convinced that they're right, and he's convinced that the community has empowered people or convinced people that it's all right to think that way, and that the psychedelic community is full of this sort of problem. But he himself is also, in a way, replicating that in this podcast series.
So anti-fundamentalism ends up leading to a new form of fundamentalism. These bad ideas that he's criticizing among pop psychedelicists, what they all have to do with at the end of the day is trying to find benefits in psychedelic drugs. You end up generating bad ideas because at the end of the day, there are no benefits, at least enduring benefits of psychedelic drugs. So that's his statement in a nutshell. He's defending the position that there are no benefits against various different pop psych theories of what the benefits are. And I think that he says that pop psychedelicists will say that they might have political benefits or environmental benefits, which they don't really have. So the pop psych community is guilty of overinflating the promise of psychedelics and making false promises that end up leading inevitably to disappointment. And I think maybe there's some parallel there between James Kent's feelings about his own career, is that it started off lofty with lofty expectations of what he could achieve, and then it ended up in disappointment at the end of it all. So I think that because in previous episodes we have specifically said that the word benefit has interpretational problems for understanding psychedelia, it would be useful here to really spell out the various positions on how to interpret the word benefit. So, as I said at the start, there's these three different narratives that have emerged. There's the pop psychedelia narrative that psychedelic drugs have benefits, and then there's James Kent's counter narrative that they don't have benefits, and then our idea that they actually do have benefits, but just in a different form than either of the first two are recognizing. And I think to sum it up, what you can say is that pop psychedelia and James Kent are both interpreting the word benefit as an egoic thing or ordinary state-based thing. So they benefit the ordinary state of consciousness, they benefit egoic life in the world, day-to-day ordinary reality. Whereas the way that you and I would understand the benefits of psychedelic drugs are not egoic, they are transcendent, and because they move beyond the egoic world model, and they're not ordinary state-based, but rather they're mystic state-based. The essential benefit overall that I think you and I would agree on is that they introduce a new state of consciousness and a new mental world model of time and control agency. And that is something that James Kent obviously completely fails to recognize because he doesn't have the Egodeath theory in his kind of intellectual armory. He just has missed it completely.
Right. He's not interested in the problem of control, of free will, of decision making. That's not something that occurred to him to be interested in.
Right. Yeah, he's just missed that whole dimension of application of psychedelic drugs.
He even says at one point in his, when he's talking about BS in this episode, that he mentions the problem of free will. There's no one's going to have an answer to it because it's just philosophical BS, which is again like putting the problem of free will into that it's just some sort of linguistic, argumentative problem that philosophers bandy back and forth from their armchairs or something like that, as opposed to being a real and tangible concern and issue that comes up in the altered state and is part of our normal everyday consciousness. To Kent, it's just the whole topic is just this: people are dressing up things with philosophical intellectualism. That's all BS anyway. He just misses the relevance of it to our lived state of consciousness and how that changes while tripping in the loose cognition state.
And it's worth repeating at that point that failure to recognize the psychedelic application towards the free will determinism problem is even spite of the fact that he has very definitely had that experience. He makes such an emphasis on saying that he had a psychotic bad trip where he would have come face to face with the problem of control in the altered state, but he just hasn't seen the connection back to the ordinary world of kind of intellectual theorizing.
Right. And it in this episode as well, he talks about, I was quite struck, he was talking about his own history of bad ideas, which I thought was kind of funny in the first place, that he was talking about how he has had tons of bad ideas before. But he was even talking about how he, according to his journals, got interested in the problem of space-time. And so it's I found this great almost sadness that he was so close, but he missed it. He somehow missed it. It went by, and I think it's because he wasn't. It was viewing it as this external thing, that space-time was some block out there in the universe somewhere to understand. That was my sense of the way he was talking about his relationship with 4D space-time, and not as something that is directly experienced in the altered state.
So he really did get very, very close to basically almost to coming up with an independent discovery of the Egodeath theory, because he has all the right concepts. He is familiar with the whole idea of four-dimensional space-time, but he just doesn't see the connection to the problem of control, the control loss experience in the psychedelic state.
And he was talking about some, it sounded like great illustrations of metaphors involving lines and things like that in his notebooks that he now kind of dismisses as childish garbage. But that sounded to me like an attempt by his mind to try to portray things like snake-shaped world lines in a block universe and these sorts of things. And I was so struck by this feeling of you missed the boat, and now here we are, and this is in the 90s, and now here we are in 2020, trying to contend with this, this person who was so close and, was drawn off course, I suppose, didn't follow it through, missed it somehow.
So if it hadn't been, had it not been for the fact that he was he was blown off course, as you said, by pop psychedelia, he could very well have become Michael Hoffman in his own right. He could have independently come up with the Egodeath theory, but his thinking was distracted by the false promises of pop psychedelia, and so he failed. Contrast that with Michael Hoffman himself, who has always been very clear about the fact that he never ever bought into pop psychedelia. He even, as an example, said that there was one time when there was a psychedelic conference really near to him that Tim Leary was speaking at, but he didn't go. Even though his friends went to it, he didn't go. So Michael Hoffman is even more independent of a thinker than James Kent is. James Kent is pretty much comparable to Michael Hoffman in terms of being an independent psychedelic thinker, but he made the mistake of buying into pop psych.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of similar elements in their backgrounds as well. That and intellectual formation that it was really striking to me. It could have led, I think, James Kent to do this kind of West Coast U.S. Kind of very like no nonsense, skeptical. There are elements of Michael Hoffman's intellectual background from atheism and skepticism. And this kind of attitude towards the past of, don't really, at least James Kent now is expressing, we don't really need to take previous ideas that, they don't have to determine our outlook as very good scientific in capital E European Enlightenment outlook. But I think that James Kent, it sounds like from James Kent's biography that his problem was that he went to the community and expected that this mythical community of psychedelics users would have the answers. And that is a key move that Michael Hoffman did not do. As you just said, that he regarded that community as not particularly authoritative. James Kent viewed the community, there must be an authority out there in the community on these things. And that in the end, I think narrowed Kent's the possibilities of Kent's thinking and theorizing.
I think that maybe this is partly because of the difference in intellectual backgrounds. Kent is not an engineer, and Michael Hoffman is, and it took the engineering mentality to come up with the Egodeath theory, which is not the same as the scientific materialist mentality which Kent has.
That's great. Yeah, the engineering mentality that kind of focus on making a model that does something that works in some way, that functions, and all else be damned. Whereas Kent is trying to apply this very strict, this very kind of limited scientific method conception to everything. There's also just the key background that it doesn't seem that. It seems like Michael Hoffman, whenever he describes his intellectual formation, he was led to this whole set of ideas not via an interest in psychedelics themselves, but via the problem of personal self-control and self-management across time, and the failures to actually to project out that control into the future. That there's a different. That really, I think, that impetus shapes a lot of the thinking in response to psychedelics. And then thirdly, I think, so while I'm riffing on this for a second, thirdly, there's that Kent is not interested in explaining or understanding religion and mysticism. He is primarily interested in demonizing it.
Right, the scorched earth.
Casting it out, yeah, because of this idea that this very simplistic story of how progress has worked, that progress works by shifting out BS via the scientific method, and that now we have scientific institutions and academic institutions that can decree what is really true via the scientific method. And I was so taken aback by this because I spent my adult life in academia, and believe me, it is not this it is not a paragon institution of objective truth that is faddish as the rest of the world is. Intellectual development does not happen along the straight path of progress, unfortunately. It just doesn't work that way. Maybe in the very controlled setting of the laboratory does the scientific method function as Kent's fantasy story would have it function.
So Kent kind of he creates an idealized, very simple model of the overall pop psych narrative, and what he says is the way the narrative goes is that the world is broken, or humanity is broken on some fundamental level. And the purpose of psychedelic drugs is to fix what is broken in either humanity or the world, or even potentially the entire galaxy. So it's the idea of healing or fixing a break. And Kent, at this point, clearly asserts his point of view on the issue, which is that psychedelics cannot do that because they are limited to a purely short-term effect. It's a drug experience which wears off after a couple of hours. He's very adamant on that point. So because of that, he can then claim that the whole of the pop psych claim about psychedelics being able to fix the world and fix human beings is lies. It's not true, because and you can verify that simply by looking at the successes of the pop psychedelia thing up until the present, which he claims is basically nothing, or at least no way near what they were what the false promises that they made. There might have been some benefits did come from psychedelics in the psychotherapeutic field, but they haven't saved the world, and they haven't saved humanity or anything like that. So these are all bad theories. And at this point, there's a clear indication of Kent's feeling of solidarity or community. He feels like, even though he might not necessarily be now a member of the pop psych community, there was a point in his past when he very much considered himself fully a member of pop psychedelia. And he says, so in amongst all of the pop psychedelia bad theories, he admits, this is at 53 minutes in, he says very clearly, I've had my own bad theories. And I did wonder if maybe at this point this was some indication about his feelings about his book, Psychedelic Information Theory, which he hardly mentions at all throughout the course of these 30 hours of recording. I wonder whether he thinks that the ideas that he expresses in psychedelic information theory are actually bad ideas or not, but he's not clear on that point. So moving on from that, he addresses Aldous Huxley. And I was actually very impressed in his treatment of Aldous Huxley that whereas when he's been talking about specific people on previous episodes, it really very quickly descends into personal level insults and character assassination and smearing of those people. But where he's dealing with Aldous Huxley, I was actually pleasantly surprised. He's much more serious and constructive on the theory deconstruction level when he's talking about Aldous Huxley compared to when he was talking about Albert Hoffman or these other people in previous episodes. So he gives a pretty detailed critique of Aldous Huxley's reducing valve analogy, which is very much probably the most prominent contribution that Aldous Huxley left in the psychedelic field. It's the thing that everybody knows about him, which is basically what he said, and James Kent spells this out very accurately, he very faithfully, according to what Huxley originally said, which is that the effect of psychedelics is to reduce cognitive filtering, and that in the ordinary state of consciousness, there's lots of filters which prevent us from experiencing things that we don't need to experience, such as like the sensation in your little toe. You never would normally think about it or experience it unless someone asked you, like, direct your attention towards your little toe and try and think what the feeling is. Or if someone hit your little toe with a hammer, you would then be very preoccupied with the sensation in your little toe. But other than that, it's just completely filtered out of your present experience, because this is really an evolutionary psychology style theory, because this is a question of survival. It's like your mind has to, there's a cognitive economy. Your mind has to focus its attention in a way to optimize your survival strategy. And if you were constantly aware, if your cognition was not filtered, and you were constantly aware of the whole range of sensory inputs into your body, you wouldn't be able to focus your mind enough to survive being eaten by a lion or something like that. So the ordinary state of consciousness for Huxley is characterized by filtration and reduction. And for Huxley, when you take a psychedelic drug, that cognitive filtering is lowered to some extent. And the high mystical experience, Egodeath, Transcendence, that kind of thing, that is what happens when cognition is ultra unfiltered, when the world is allowed to beam into consciousness absolutely fully with no filtration mechanism in the way. So Kent characterizes that model very well. And then he begins to criticize it. And it's when he criticizes it that his failure to really understand the significance of that model comes through. So I think the most basic thing you can say is what you and I would recognize is that what Huxley's project is there is in the domain of cognitive phenomenology. But what James Kent does is he doesn't recognize that, and instead he mistakes Huxley's theory for, and this is directly quoting the words that he uses, he says that Huxley would have understood his own theory as being objective, scientific, neuroscientific, neurophysical, materialist, that kind of thing, dealing with physical reality rather than patterns of cognition in different cognitive states. So that's a major misunderstanding that James Kent there. He doesn't recognize that what Huxley is doing is phenomenology and not neuroscience.
It's huge. It really struck me as this struck me as a really great example of something I was trying to capture in earlier recordings, and I think in the Albert Hoffman discussion that we had, that what strikes me as very wrong about a lot of Kent's approach to earlier figures, and especially to the cognitive phenomenology aspect, and just to the broader cultural place of psychedelics and the way that authors have written about psychedelics, that he is, again, I mean, he states in this episode that the only criterion that we should use to evaluate anything is the scientific method to lead to objectivity. And I think that's fine in a laboratory, for example, but it is not sufficient outside of the laboratory to account for all of the phenomenon of the world and of subjective experiencing. But Kent doesn't. I mean, I found, like, I'd never read Huxley before, but I picked up a copy of it because I was curious to read The Doors of Perception, and Huxley does not present that as a work of science, as a scientific report at all. He presents it as it's this kind of weird genre of writing, this very wide-ranging essay. There's a lot of art criticism in it, for example. There's comments about society. It's a kind of genre that I don't really read much being produced today, this wide-ranging essay that you have a literary figure who touches upon a huge number of topics. I don't really read that sort of essay as much today. I don't think it's very familiar to a lot of people, and I think that in the 50s you have people talking about science, so to speak, in scare quotes, or scientific things, in a more literary or philosophical way than the kind of strict laboratory approach would allow for. And so Kent is, I mean, in my view, Kent is misreading Huxley and the reducing valve. I don't think I haven't read a lot of his later writing. There's certainly talk in there about brain chemistry, like sugar and stuff like that. And so he does seem to be trying to somehow connect it to brain function, and I think it's would be fair to critique from a strictly brain function, stuff you can measure in a laboratory or whatever point of view on how does psychedelics work in the brain. But when you read I was struck looking at the passage in The Doors of Perception where he brings up the valve theory. He's explicit that he is bringing it up as a philosophical idea. He says, after some reflection, I found myself in agreement with this philosopher at the University of Cambridge, C.D. Broad, who himself is citing an earlier French philosopher, Henri Bergson, about the mind eliminating all sorts of other things. So that's how the mind normally functions.
Oh, was that pre-Huxley?
This is pre-Huxley, yes. So there's 2 points here that in Kent's framing, you would think that Huxley just had this idea while he was tripping, but Huxley is, in fact, extremely explicit that he thought about it afterwards and drew upon his intellectual context and this background of reading widely amongst philosophers. He did not just occur. This idea did not occur to him while tripping, which is how Kent presents the whole episode, that people have lots of bad ideas while they're tripping and no way of filtering out bad ideas, and that's what we should use objective scientific method for. But that's not what Huxley did. Huxley says explicitly in the text, in the Doors of Perception, that it was something that he drew from philosophical authors and thought it did not come to him while tripping. It's something that he thought about later. So it's not a scientific lab report or even like coming from his, directly from his trip at all. So this is an example. Again, I thought that Kent's presentation of the Huxley thing, while fair in some ways, was a great example of the limitations of his approach. He's trying to like interpret somebody who is doing all sorts of moves and writerly moves, literary moves that he doesn't seem to be aware of and doesn't take into account. I mean, to keep ranting for a moment, to present Huxley's theory and this book called The Doors of Perception without mentioning the name William Blake is, to me, just distorting misrepresentation. I mean, you can't understand what Huxley's doing without understanding that he's drawing from William Blake, the poet and artist. Huxley's drawing from an artistic sort of mindset, a poetic mindset here. Now, you can say that that's inappropriate when describing neurological brain functions. That's fine. But to just ascribe completely that the reducing valve is just a scientific theory and it's a bad theory, that is, I think, absurd. It's clearly not what Huxley's doing. But because James Kent thinks that all you need to evaluate anything in the world is the scientific method, he ignores that.
So on the face of it, it's really quite baffling how he could possibly interpret Huxley's theory in that way. But actually reading between the lines, maybe you could just say that it's because he has to, because that's the only attack he knows, is to say that something is unscientific. So he has to cast it as a scientific theory so that he can come to the rescue and say that it's actually unscientific.
Yes, that helpfully crystallizes what I think my main takeaway on the problem of James Kent's approach to all of this. That doesn't make me a defender of everything Aldous Huxley wrote at all, but there is something really off about James Kent's approach because he's interpreting things, he's overstepping his bounds. He is using the scientific method inappropriately. It does not apply, it is not sufficient to explain and analyze and critique the fullness of the reducing valve image or pretty much anything else outside of the laboratory context and pseudoscientific ideas like trepanation. Sure. Fine. That's fine. Looking at the reducing valve thing, I was struck by, for example, approaching it with our kind of metaphor background, that it's a water metaphor. It's a loose cognition water metaphor. There's a tight cognition. The valve prevents things from flowing. He constantly is using flowing imagery that then when the psychedelic, the mescaline in his usage, creates a bypass. This is, again, a kind of plumbing water course metaphor. Creates a bypass that then allows things to seep through or ooze through or flow through or trickle through that otherwise cannot. So that's an example of coming at it with a more metaphor literary sort of approach and seeing that in a way, like I don't care about its value as a hard, like, materialist scientific theory. it's noteworthy in that it is I think an attempt to describe that kind of loose cognition switch. You switch from tight cognition to loose cognition. That I think we would put in that like cognitive phenomenology area.
Yeah, so Huxley is trying to come up with his own version of that, a two-state theory of cognition, basically, which is the same as what loose cognition and tight cognition does. Huxley was trying to address that same explanatory problem of the difference between the two states of consciousness. What actually is that difference?
And I have one more item in my rant here. If you will indulge me, I have one more item that
Please, yeah.
that if you listen to James Kent talk about Aldous Huxley's reducing valve, you get the impression that what he means is that you can perceive all of the world or perceive all these things that you can't normally perceive, and that in James Kent's mind, this is then what leads to people saying you can perceive supernatural things, right?
Right.
I was struck by reading Huxley what he's really concerned about. He in fact rejects that explicitly in the Doors on 2 pages in the Doors of Perception. I will cite it here, my copy on page 24 and page 26. He says, "I am not talking about perceiving everything in the world. What I'm talking about is perceiving the all within the all, a kind of qualitative increase in perception, not a quantitative increase in perception. We're not perceiving more data. We're perceiving a kind of better sort of data, or heightened significance. Maybe that's what it really is, the heightened significance of any particular object or something like that." And Huxley's formulation may be sloppy. It may imply things it shouldn't. I don't know. That's fine. We can sort that out. But it is explicitly not about perceiving more of the world. I don't know if people have taken it that way. I don't know if Huxley later on, there's some writings on psychedelics he did that I have not read that perhaps James Kent is referring to. I'm simply following James Kent, claiming that he is presenting the Doors of Perception theory in a certain way.
Right, so he's completely misinterpreted the Doors of Perception from your point of view.
From my point of view, yes. Yes.
However, I mean, to be full and fair in our assessment of Kent, there is a second argument which he uses against Huxley's reducing valve analogy, which is different and which I think maybe has more merit to it, which he says that he points out that what Huxley is doing is unifying all mystical experience, but Kent is responding that there's more than one type of mystical experience, therefore Huxley's theory cannot be true, because he says that you have a different mystical experience on ketamine and compared to the one that you have on LSD, which would be different from datura, that kind of thing. And I think that is an important that's an important idea to understand in relation of the Egodeath theory, because if indeed Kent is right about that as a critique of Huxley's theory, then it would seem that it also applies to the Egodeath theory. So how would the Egodeath theory respond to the criticism that how can you characterize all mystical experiences as being loosened cognition, given that there are different drugs that create qualitatively different types of mystical experience? So I think that there's an onus on both Huxley's theory and on the Egodeath theory to address that criticism. And I think that maybe how I would characterize Egodeath theory response is that the difference, the apparent qualitative differences between, say, a Salvia Divinorum experience versus an LSD experience are they're less significant. They play a less significant role in the outcome of the experience, and they both share that fundamental quality of being loosened cognition. They just, perhaps you could call them different versions of loose cognition, but they both are loose cognition, and they both are mystic altered state experiences. I don't know, do you agree with that?
Wait, say that again. Rephrase that, please.
So I'm trying to answer Kent's criticism of Huxley's theory, but from the point of view of the Egodeath theory. How does the Egodeath theory account for the difference between a Salvia Divinorum experience and a LSD experience, say? given that they are different in a very big way, that the way that the descriptions of those two kind of experiences do not really match that much. And yet, from the point of view of the ego-death theory, they're both mystic altered state, they're both loosened cognition. How do you explain that?
Right, there's something connecting them on the kind of at the basic level. I think would we say in the ego-death theory, I mean, it's, it strikes me there's maybe a couple different levels. Would we say that basically the basic action is this loosening of cognitive associations at the perceptual level and at the kind of more concept oriented level, that there's that sort of change in consciousness is going to be somehow similar across the various psychedelics?
Right, so somehow similar but not completely identical. So at a deeper level, they're all loose cognition, but at a shallower level, they're different drugs, different kinds of experiences on a shallow phenomenological level.
And then would we say, like, effect-wise, that they have the potential to cause the seizure of self-will, creating that runaway feedback problem?
So they have the potential to cause the runaway feedback and then the resultant transformation of the mental world model to include the deterministic mental world model. All of this that we're now covering, this is something that Huxley did not get this far. He did not. This is, in other words, what we're pointing to now is the superior level of sophistication that the ego-death theory has over Huxley's theory. So, yeah, but I guess, yeah, that's how ego-death theory answers Kant's criticism, and then how would Huxley's theory then answer the same criticism? I suppose you could apply the same thing, that the basic analogy of lowered cognitive filtering works for all the different psychedelic drugs. It's just that there may be more superficial characterizations and qualities of these different psychedelic experiences that differ for the different drugs. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, it strikes me Huxley is coming to it with he wrote this other book called The Perennial Philosophy that I haven't read it in detail, but my familiarity with it is that he surveys various religious and philosophical mystical traditions from around the world and says they're all referring to the same sort of thing. So I think he already approached this with that, having done this kind of research and come to this sort of conclusion in the background. So I think probably really answering what would Huxley say to that criticism requires going to that text.
Okay.
I would think. I don't know if it's really I don't know if I'd be fully interested in doing that or not, but because that's what struck me reading The Doors of Perception, and I think it struck James Kent as well. He says, we should dismiss this valve theory because it's a mystical idea first and foremost.
That's Kent's position.
That's Kent's position. He says we should reject it because it is drawn from mysticism, and we should just reject those things out of as a matter of course.
So on the whole, I think I have quite a positive assessment of. I think that. I take James Kent. I think James Kent made a more serious effort with Huxley than he did with Albert Hoffman, and I think that really stood out from that.
I don't disagree. I don't think it was. I don't disagree with that. I don't think it was as much of a smear job, but I think it to me became this case example of trying to define this nagging feeling I've had of what is getting at me about James Kent's approach and analysis of a lot of the community, so to speak, or of the role in culture, or of evaluating what people have written. And I think it's that what I tried to define earlier as insisting that the only criterion with which to even read and understand authors and evaluate them is this very narrowly defined scientific method leading to true objectivity. This is coming out of my own kind of literary studies and approach, I think, largely. And I think that it ends up distorting I mean, I don't know what's the value. I mean, what are we trying to say? Am I trying to save Aldous Huxley here? Not really, but I think that I think that it makes me suspicious of James Kent's presentations of people. I suppose I'm falling into a James Kent trap here of being interested in distortion and disinformation. That's something he's very concerned about, and I seem to be mimicking that he's spreading misinformation about what Huxley said. But but because I think, in some ways it's James Kent is very clear that he is intentionally trying to be negative. He's not trying to, he's not after some sort of like fair presentation. But I think maybe that's what gets to me, is that then we're claiming to use this, this supposedly objective thing, while at the same time, this objective criterion of the scientific method to sort everything, while at the same time saying, I'm going to be as negative as I can in order to discredit people and then move the community, so to speak. And that kind of, I think that there's something about that gets to me as a kind of research practice.
Yeah, he's committed to sensationalism. So moving on from that, so that was his addressing of Aldous Huxley. For the remainder of the podcast, he really was basically repeating his main overall point, that there is absolutely no real long-term enduring value to psychedelic tripping. It's just a temporary recreational fun, and anything that you might think remains after the psychedelic trip has worn off is just bullshit, in his own terminology. So it gets you high and there's no permanent change. And then Kent makes a very important statement. He says, there's no such thing as being permanently high. And I think this is an important point to explain in reference to the Egodeath theory, that I think there is a kind of implicit spiritual expectation of a permanent state of altered consciousness. And when you look at like the pop psychedelia and pop spirituality idea of what an enlightened spiritual master, transcended master would look like, would be some kind of permanent altered state of consciousness. And I think that what Egodeath theory does is it explains the reality of what you can realistically expect from psychedelic drug use on a long-term or permanent basis. And it's not a permanent altered state of consciousness. That never happens. And also the writer Ken Wilber, who I think was, one of the most foundationally important writers to the Egodeath theory. Like, the Egodeath theory is very much shaped like Ken Wilber's thinking. Ken Wilber had this distinction between states and stages. And I think that's what it comes down to. When James Kent says there's no such thing as permanently being high on drugs, he's failing to incorporate Ken Wilber's distinction between states and stages. You don't get a permanent state of altered consciousness, but on the other hand, you get two things. You get the never-ending ability to re-enter the temporary altered state of cognition, and you also get a permanent transition of stage, which is you become aware of the transcendent world model. You have a memory of the end of world conflagrating ego death experience. So you can remember what it's like to be dead, and that is enlightenment or spiritual transcendence from the point of view of the ego death theory. That if you are the kind of person who can say, I had this trip when I took acid one time and I had this feeling that I was dead, that the world had ended, that everything had already happened, that kind of thing, that in virtue of having that memory and of having incorporated it and accepted it into your daily life, you are this spiritually transcended, enlightened person. Whereas James Kent is making the mistake of expecting that to equate to a permanent state of consciousness, as if you were tripping all the time. But obviously, to go back to the whole anthropological dimension of survival, that obviously would never work. You'd need to have a team of people around you looking after you, feeding you, cleaning you, all that kind of thing, if you were tripping all the time. That's not a realistic, desirable end state. Whereas from the point of view of ego death theory, the genuine expected end state is simply to have the memory of the transcendent experience.
I think that there's. Would you agree that there's different ways of sorting? I mean, to bring up the term benefit again, that the ego death theory tries to make clear that what psychedelic tripping is really all about, and that the benefit to tripping is in a way to have that experience. It's not merely pure recreation, but it's to have that experience and to deal with the death of independent selfhood, of independent ego agency, and build up the eternalism model. Now, that building up the eternalism model is both an experienced thing, it's a felt thing. One feels oneself embedded in the space-time block, for example, and then it's also, so that's maybe one thing. There's that kind of felt experience that can be somehow, and then that's somehow a benefit. I was about to say, I don't really know quite what that means, but it's somehow like having that experience is somehow, it's a thing to do. That, I think, like, having done it, one could say, oh, it's recreational. Of course, it never stops being terrifying in a certain way, right? But it is, one could describe that as recreational, I suppose. And then, but then later on, the kind of intellectual building up of the model, or the understanding of the model in whatever terms, whatever, the ego theory both has its definition of what that intellectual model or conceptual understanding of the whole experience is, and then also decoding or understanding of other attempts to explain that. And that, I think, in the ego death theory, we might say a benefit is having a good or clear, maybe the best conception of what that experience is all about. And a method of interpreting other people and other cultural institutions, history, religion, etc., literature, art, music, whatever, from that, using that model that the ego death theory provides. So there's a kind of maybe intellectual benefit or interpretive benefit, so to speak. There's some sort of outcome, and that's specifically to the ego death theory, that may not be true of tripping in and of itself or only by itself. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think from our perspective with the ego death theory, we're talking about two related but distinct areas. We're talking about tripping itself, and then we're talking about this interpretive model that we've become familiar with. What I'm trying to separate here in discourse is the difference between kind of two distinct areas. One is the so-called benefit of tripping itself and the experience of altered state, frozen time, determinism, canceling, self-control, etc. And then the later on kind of conceptual framework to understand that. And that the ego death theory, we could say that a benefit of it is the clear modeling of understanding that experience and the interpretive paradigm of that lets us decode or understand or grasp the deep meaning of all sorts of other attempts to explain that that set of experiences. So we could say there's some benefit to that, some sort of satisfaction or something like that, in both understanding the experience in certain terms and in understanding other attempts to explain it. I think the ego theory is rather circumspect. It doesn't promise us the world.
No, it doesn't. I think that Kent cannot make the same accusation against the ego death theory that he does against pop psych. Ego death theory doesn't give false promises. It's not really a particularly optimistic theory at all. It just lacks that dimension completely. It just sticks to the stated goal of explaining the loose cognition experience and explaining the cultural and religious significance of the loose cognition experience. Yes, I agree. It's circumspect. So Kent, to compare that to where James Kent is at, he's denying that there's benefits from psychedelic tripping, and he doesn't even acknowledge the presence or absence of benefits of a full intellectual comprehension of psychedelic tripping.
No, it's like it's like because way he's framing it, that it is somehow incompatible with objective rationality, that he is closing off the idea of there being any sort of rationality to altered state experiencing, which is a direct something that the Egodeath theory directly speaks out against.
It is an actual counterexample too.
Yes, exactly. So it's kind of like Kent has decided that it's just psychosis. There is no rationality to it. Whereas the Egodeath theory says there is a rationality to it. It's not the same sort of rationality of the ordinary state, but there is a rationality to it. And that full so-called rationality requires having both sorts, understanding fully both sorts of rationality.
So in a sense, Kent is kind of saying there couldn't possibly be an Egodeath theory because then there would have to be a rational explanation, and there isn't one. So Egodeath theory cannot possibly exist, and that explains why he has singularly failed to incorporate any element of it into his thinking.
Yeah, it's just a hallucination. The altered state is just a hallucination, and it is incompatible with the scientific method. And religion is just BS, and that's all. So he really is failing to explain and puts off trying to explain either or grasp either. He throws his hands up and says the only explanation there is just to reject it. Both altered state experiencing, essentially. I mean, if you follow his logic out, there's no point in doing altered state experiencing at all, except for a little bit of fun or something like that. And, I mean, this is why I keep coming back to bringing up that in the end, Kent just stays in the kind of prohibitionist status quo. He ends up being a defender of that. Whether he wants to be or not, his reasoning leads him to do that.
Yeah, he is in denial about his own supportive prohibitionist attitude, I think. He doesn't want that to be the case, yeah, but he just doesn't, he can't escape it. His thinking is prohibitionist one way or another.